June 22nd, 1944. The earth gave up its secret in the rain. It was not a gentle surrender. A shell crater, overflowing with muddy water, had collapsed one wall of the thing, exposing a darkness that was older than the war itself. A sergeant, his face a mask of exhaustion and grime, was the first to see it. Not a natural hollow, but a corridor, lined with rotting timber, descending into the black. The air that wafted out was cold, carrying a smell of damp concrete, rust, and something else, something faintly chemical. He called for the lieutenant. They shone their torches into the void. The beams, weak and yellow, did little to push back the shadows. But they illuminated enough, a stack of crates, stenciled with German eagles and markings he couldn't read. A field desk, overturned, and on the wall, a map, stained with what looked like old blood. This was not a front-line position. It was something else. A tomb, forgotten by the advancing war. The lieutenant, a man named Miller, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was the place. The one mentioned in the fragment of intelligence they'd found on the dead courier. The bunker was real. And according to that blood-stained piece of paper, someone had been left inside. The discovery changed everything. The unit, a battle-weary reconnaissance platoon, had been pushing through the hedgerows for days, their objective a crossroads 2 miles ahead. This was not on their maps. This was not part of the plan. Lieutenant Miller radioed battalion, his voice a low crackle over the static. He reported the find, using the code phrase they'd been given for such contingencies. Nightingale has fallen. The response was immediate and unsettling. They were to secure the perimeter. No one was to enter. A special team was being dispatched. Their own mission was effectively put on hold. For the next 12 hours, they were guardians of a hole in the ground. The men did not like it. They felt exposed, static in contested territory. The rain continued, a constant, dreary drumming on their helmets. They dug foxholes, set up machine gun nests, and watched the tree line. Their eyes kept drifting back to the dark maw of the bunker entrance. It felt like a wound in the earth, a void that watched them back. Private Firstian Jenkins, barely 19, swore he heard scratching from deep within, a slow, deliberate scraping of metal on concrete. The others told him it was rats or the wind or his own nerves, but they all heard it. The special team arrived just after dusk in an unmarked covered vehicle. They were not like any soldiers the platoon had seen. They wore no unit patches, their uniforms were slightly different in cut, and they moved with a quiet, unnerving efficiency. Their leader was a tall, gaunt man who introduced himself only as Captain Sterling. His eyes were pale, almost colourless in the fading light, and they missed nothing. He shook Lieutenant Miller's hand, a brief, cold gesture, and immediately began questioning him about the bunker. Had anyone gone in? Had anything been removed? Miller answered in the negative. Sterling seemed to relax, but only slightly. With his team of 4, Sterling approached the bunker entrance. They carried powerful electric lanterns, their beams cutting sharp white paths through the gloom. They also carried specialized equipment, gas detectors, Geiger counters, and heavy canvas bags. Without a word to the watching platoon, they disappeared inside. The waiting began anew. This time, it was worse. The men outside could only imagine what was happening in that subterranean world. The occasional shout, muffled by earth and concrete, echoed out. The beams of light from below would sometimes flash erratically, casting long, dancing shadows up the crater wall. An hour passed. Then 2. The rain finally ceased, leaving a heavy, wet silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. It was during this quiet that Jenkins, on watch near the entrance, heard it clearly. Not scratching. A voice. Faint, thin, a child's voice, singing a tune he did not recognize. It was in German. It lasted for only a few seconds, then was swallowed by the silence. He was too terrified to report it. Who would believe him? Below, Captain Sterling was confronting a mystery that defied all logic. The bunker was larger than it appeared from the surface. It was a complex of 3 rooms, all reinforced with concrete and steel. The first room was a command post, filled with the detritus of a hurried departure. The second was a communications room, the equipment smashed beyond repair. But the third room was a laboratory. Glass beakers and test tubes lay shattered on the floor. Strange, unidentifiable machines hummed with a residual power, their dials still glowing with a faint greenish light. And in the corner, a large metal cage. The door was open. It was empty. On a central table, Sterling found a journal. The cover was stamped with the insignia of the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi occult research branch. The pages were filled with dense, spidery handwriting and complex schematics. He could not read most of it, but one word was repeated again and again, circled in red ink. Kindersoldat. Child soldier. Another word was scrawled in the margin of the last page, the ink blotched as if written in a frantic hurry. Vergeltung. Retribution. His radio operator, a corporal named Evans, called him over to a bank of filing cabinets. One drawer was locked. Sterling used a pry bar to wrench it open. Inside were not files, but personal effects. A small, tattered teddy bear, a child's drawing of a house and a smiling Sunday, and a single, dog-eared photograph. It showed a group of boys, none of them older than 12, dressed in ill-fitting German army uniforms. They stood stiffly, their faces pale and empty. In the background was this very bunker. Sterling felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. He pocketed the photograph. This was no ordinary military installation. This was something far darker. His Geiger counter remained silent. His gas detector showed nothing. The danger here was not radiological or chemical. It was something else entirely. Something that had been left behind. Or perhaps something that had escaped. The empty cage taunted him. What had they been keeping in there? And where was it now? Up on the surface, the tension was reaching a breaking point. A patrol reported movement in the tree line to the east. Not Germans. Something smaller, faster, moving through the undergrowth with an uncanny silence. They fired a few flares, illuminating the shattered landscape in a harsh white light. Nothing was there. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted by an unseen enemy, settled over the entire platoon. Lieutenant Miller approached the bunker entrance, peering down into the darkness. He could see the faint glow of Sterling's lanterns deep within. He was about to call out when a sound froze the words in his throat. It was a soft, rhythmic clicking, like two stones being tapped together. It was coming from inside the bunker, but it was moving, getting closer. He drew his pistol, his heart hammering against his ribs. The clicking stopped. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was one of Sterling's men, a private named Davies. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost peaceful. He was clutching his left arm, which was bleeding from a deep, ragged gash. He looked at Miller, his mouth working soundlessly for a moment before he managed to whisper a single, baffling sentence. "The walls, they have eyes." Then he collapsed. The bunker, designated Site Gamma by Captain Sterling's obscure branch of military intelligence, was now a crime scene. A crime without a clear perpetrator, a wound in the earth that was now actively bleeding into their reality. Private Davies was carried to the medic's tent, mumbling incoherently about shadows that moved against the current of the wind and a whispering that came from the very stone. The platoon's medic, a pragmatic man from Chicago, cleaned and stitched the wound. It was clean, precise, almost surgical, but with a savage, tearing quality at one end. It looked, he confided to Lieutenant Miller in a hushed tone, like the bite of a very large, very intelligent animal. But there were no teeth marks, just a smooth, deep incision. Captain Sterling emerged from the bunker shortly after, his face a grim mask. He had heard Davies's final cryptic words. He ordered the bunker entrance sealed with a charge of explosives. The resulting rumble sent a cloud of dirt and debris into the air, collapsing the entrance completely. The secret was to be reburied, at least for now. But Miller could see the unease in Sterling's eyes. This was not a man accustomed to fear. This was a man who had just encountered something his training and his classified briefings had not prepared him for. "We are leaving," Sterling announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Your platoon will escort us to the secondary extraction point. Grid reference 79er Charlie. Radio silence from this moment forward. The men shouldered their packs, their movements sluggish with a new kind of fatigue. It was not the physical exhaustion of combat, but the mental drain of the unknown. They had faced German tanks and machine gun nests with a certain grim acceptance. This was different. This was a ghost in their midst, a threat they could not see, could not understand. As they formed up to move out, Jenkins kept looking back at the freshly turned earth where the bunker had been. He could still hear that child's song, a ghostly melody stuck in his head. Their route took them through a narrow, wooded valley that had been spared the worst of the shelling. The trees were tall and thick, their branches creating a canopy that blotted out the moon. They moved in a single file, the only sounds the squelch of their boots in the mud and the laboured rhythm of their breathing. Sterling and his remaining 3 operatives walked in the centre of the column, their senses on high alert, their weapons, strange devices that looked like modified submachine guns with oversized magazines, held at the ready. After an hour of silent marching, the point man held up a clenched fist. The column froze. He gestured forward, into a small clearing. Lieutenant Miller moved up to join him. In the centre of the clearing stood the ruins of a small stone cottage, its roof caved in by a shell. But it was not the cottage that had caught the point man's attention. It was the figure sitting on a fallen log beside it. It was a boy. He looked to be no more than 10 or 11 years old. He was dressed in a ragged, oversized German army tunic that hung from his thin frame like a shroud. His hair was matted, his face smudged with dirt. He was rocking back and forth, humming a tuneless melody. In his hands, he held a stick, with which he was methodically drawing patterns in the mud. Miller's first instinct was pity, a lost child, caught in the hell of war. He took a step forward. "Hey, son," he said, his voice soft. "It's all right. We're Americans." The boy stopped rocking. He stopped humming. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were the oldest thing Miller had ever seen. They were not the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of something ancient, something that had seen countless horrors. They held no fear, only a cold, detached curiosity. The boy looked at Miller, then at the rest of the platoon emerging from the trees. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. Captain Sterling pushed his way to the front, his weapon coming up. "Do not approach him," he hissed, his voice tight with urgency. "He's just a boy, Captain," Miller retorted, his humanitarian instinct clashing with Sterling's paranoia. "Is he?" Sterling's pale eyes were fixed on the child. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph he had found in the bunker. He glanced at it, then back at the boy. His blood ran cold. It was the same child. The one from the photograph, the one in the uniform. He had not aged a day. The boy stood up. He dropped the stick. He looked directly at Sterling, and in a clear, calm voice, he spoke a single sentence in flawless English. "The Nightingale is waiting for your song, Captain." It was the countersign. The response to Nightingale has fallen. A phrase that should have been known only to Sterling and his high command. A wave of pure dread washed over the intelligence officer. This was no victim. This was the mission. Before anyone could react, the boy's demeanor changed. The ancient look in his eyes vanished, replaced by a convincing mask of childish terror. He let out a terrified whimper and pointed a trembling finger past the soldiers, into the dark woods behind them. "Der Schattenmann!" he cried. The shadow man. Every soldier spun around, weapons raised, scanning the tree line for the threat. It was a perfect, instinctive distraction. When Miller turned back, the boy was gone, vanished, as if he had never been there. All that remained were the strange, swirling patterns he had drawn in the mud. They were not random scribbles. They were complex geometric symbols, interwoven with what looked like circuit diagrams. Captain Sterling stared at the drawings, his face a parchment of horror. He recognized the designs. They were a crude but accurate representation of the internal schematics for the Norden bomb site, one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Allied war effort. The forest was no longer just a forest. Every shadow now held a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a possible footstep. The platoon moved on, their pace quickened by a fear that was now cold and sharp. The encounter with the boy had shattered their understanding of the war. This was no longer a conflict of armies, but something far more sinister. Captain Sterling walked beside Lieutenant Miller, his voice low and intense. "What you saw back there, that is the reason for this operation. It is code-named Silent Nightingale," he began to explain, in clipped, classified terms. In late 1943, Allied intelligence began picking up strange, fragmented signals from deep within German territory. They were not standard military communications. They were bursts of encrypted data, mixed with what sounded like biological readings, heartbeats, neural activity. The source was a mystery. Then, the interrogations of high-ranking Nazi scientists, captured in the aftermath of various raids, began to yield a consistent and unbelievable thread. A project hidden from even the upper echelons of the SS. An initiative not to build a better tank or a deadlier bomb, but to create a new kind of intelligence agent, a perfect, undetectable weapon. They called it the Kindersoldat program. The theory was as brilliant as it was monstrous. Take a child, preferably an orphan, one who would not be missed. Subject them to a brutal regimen of psychological conditioning, pharmacological manipulation, and something else. Something the scientists referred to only as cognitive integration. The goal was to break down the child's personality and rebuild it as a perfect, blank slate, a vessel. Into this vessel, they would implant vast quantities of information, military schematics, codebooks, enemy troop dispositions, even the personal histories and psychological profiles of enemy commanders. The child would become a living, breathing library of classified information, but they would appear to be nothing more than a lost, traumatized waif of war. They would be found by Allied patrols, taken to safety, and processed through military intelligence. And once inside the secure facilities, behind the lines they would activate. "Activate?" Miller asked, his mouth dry. "A trigger phrase," Sterling said, his eyes scanning the dark trees, a specific sequence of words. Once heard, it would cause the subject to access the implanted information. They would then relay it, by any means necessary, to a German handler. They are the ultimate sleeper agents, walking, talking repositories of everything the Nazis wanted to know about us. "And the boy back there, is one of them?" Sterling confirmed. "Subject Gamma, according to the bunker records, but he is a prototype, unstable. The project was supposed to be shut down. The bunker was to be destroyed. But something went wrong. He escaped. Or he was set loose. The implications were staggering. How many of these children were already behind their lines? How many had they themselves rescued and sent to the rear? The kindness of soldiers was being used as a weapon against them. The thought turned Miller's stomach. Their march continued through the night. The secondary extraction point was an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of a small village that intelligence reported as cleared. As they approached, the first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern sky, casting the world in a murky grey pallor. The farmhouse looked quiet. Too quiet. There were no signs of life, not even the usual birdsong. The air was still and heavy. Sterling signalled a halt. He dispatched 2 of his men to flank the building and conduct a silent reconnaissance. The platoon took up defensive positions in a ditch overlooking the farmyard. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. Miller watched the farmhouse, his Thompson submachine gun feeling heavy and useless in his hands. How do you fight a child? A single, sharp whistle cut through the silence. The all clear. Sterling gestured, and the platoon rose from the ditch and moved cautiously towards the farmhouse. The front door was ajar. One of Sterling's men, a Sergeant Ross, stood in the doorway, his face grim. "Captain," Ross said, his voice flat, "you need to see this." Inside, the farmhouse was a scene of controlled chaos. It had been used as a temporary command post, recently abandoned. Maps were strewn across a large table, coffee cups sat half full, and a field radio, its casing smashed, lay in the corner. But it was the centre of the room that drew the eye. The other member of Sterling's reconnaissance team, Private Cooper, was on his knees. He was not moving. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide and unblinking. A thin trail of saliva dripped from his slack jaw. Sterling knelt in front of him. "Cooper." "Report." "Soldier." There was no response. Cooper was catatonic. In his hand he clutched a small, crude doll made of straw and tied with string. It was a child's toy. Ross pointed a trembling finger towards the far wall. Scrawled in what looked like charcoal, in a clumsy, childish hand, was a message: "I know what you fear." And below it, a single word: Vergeltung, retribution. The farmhouse was not a sanctuary. It was a trap. A psychological gauntlet laid by a mind that was both brilliantly intelligent and profoundly broken. Captain Sterling felt the walls of the operation closing in on him. The boy subject Gamma was not just hiding from them. He was hunting them. He was playing with them, using their own protocols and fears against them. The catatonic Private Cooper was a message, a demonstration of the subject's capabilities. This was not merely espionage. This was psychological warfare of the most intimate and terrifying kind. "We need to move. Now," Sterling barked, his composure cracking for the first time. "Ross, get Cooper on his feet. We're leaving this place." But Cooper was a dead weight, lost in some inner prison of his own mind. It took 2 men to half carry, half drag him from the farmhouse. The platoon formed a defensive perimeter in the farmyard, their eyes scanning the surrounding fields and the tree line beyond. The sun was fully up now, but it offered no warmth, no comfort. The light only made the scene feel more exposed, more vulnerable. Lieutenant Miller approached Sterling. "Captain, we can't go on like this. My men are at the end of their rope. We need to get back to battalion. Report this." "Report what, Lieutenant?" Sterling snapped, his pale eyes blazing. "That we are being stalked by a child who can read minds and turn men into vegetables. They would lock us all in a psychiatric ward. This mission is classified beyond your comprehension. Our orders are clear. Secure the asset or terminate it. There is no third option." "Terminate a child?" Miller's voice was thick with disgust. "That is not a child." Sterling's shout echoed across the farmyard, causing several of the soldiers to flinch. He lowered his voice, leaning in close to Miller. "It is a weapon. A sophisticated, dangerous, and malfunctioning weapon. It has already killed, or worse, everyone who has come into contact with it. Davies. Cooper. God knows how many others back in that bunker. Your sentimentality will get us all killed." The argument was cut short by the sound of an engine. A low, throaty rumble, growing closer. From a lane behind the farmhouse, a covered vehicle emerged. It was German, a Opel Blitz, its canvas cover torn and stained. It rolled to a stop about 100 yards away, its engine idling roughly. The driver's door was open, but there was no one inside. Every weapon in the platoon was instantly trained on the vehicle. It was a perfect ambush position. They waited, fingers on triggers, for the muzzle flashes from behind the truck, for the telltale whine of a mortar shell. Nothing happened. The truck just sat there, rumbling, an empty metal shell. "Jenkins, O'Malley, flank it." Miller ordered, his military training overriding his fear. The 2 privates moved out, low and fast, circling wide to approach the truck from the sides. After a tense minute, Jenkins's voice came over the radio. "Clear, sir. No one here. But you need to see the back." Miller and Sterling approached cautiously. The rear canvas flap of the truck was tied open. Inside, the cargo bay was filled with bodies. They were German soldiers, a full squad, maybe more. They were not shot. They showed no visible wounds. Their faces were frozen in identical masks of sheer, absolute terror, their eyes wide and staring. It was a truck full of corpses, all dead from fright, and sitting cross-legged on the back bumper amidst this charnel house was the boy. He was cleaning a knife with a piece of cloth, his movements slow and methodical. He looked up as they approached, his ancient eyes meeting theirs. "They were loud," the boy said, his voice calm, conversational. "They made too much noise." "I do not like noise." Sterling raised his weapon. "Subject Gamma. The operation is over. You will come with me." The boy smiled. It was a small, cold smile. "You are not my handler, Captain. My handler is dead. I killed him. He was going to decommission me. That is the word they use, decommission, like a broken radio." He gestured with the knife towards the truckload of dead men. "They were looking for me too, to put me back in the dark. I do not like the dark." Miller felt a wave of nausea. The boy was not just a passive intelligence gatherer. He was a predator, a killer, and he was completely, terrifyingly rational. "The Vergeltung Protocol," Sterling said, keeping his weapon aimed. "What is it?" The boy's smile widened. "It is the song the nightingale sings. The final song. It is already written. You cannot stop it. You can only listen." He stood up, dropping the blood-stained cloth. "I have a new mission now, a better one." "And what is that?" Miller asked, against his better judgment. The boy looked at him, and for a fleeting second the ancient mask slipped, and Miller saw something else. A profound, bottomless loneliness. A hurt that was decades deep. "To find a quiet place," the boy whispered. "A place where no one looks for you, no one uses you, no one is ever loud again." With a speed that was blinding, he moved. He didn't run away. He darted forward, towards Sterling. The captain fired, a 3-round burst that tore into the truck's metal side where the boy had been a split second before. The boy was a blur, ducking under Sterling's arm, his small hand flashing out. There was a wet, slicing sound. Sterling cried out, dropping his weapon and clutching his forearm. A deep gash welled with blood, identical to the one on Private Davies. The boy was already 10 yards away, melting into the tall grass of the field like a ghost. "After him!" Sterling roared. His face contorted in pain and rage. The platoon surged forward, a wave of green cloth and steel, firing blindly into the grass. It was useless. The boy was gone. Vanished as completely as the morning mist. All that was left was the idling truck, its cargo of the dead, and a growing, chilling certainty in the heart of every man present. They were not the hunters, they were the prey, and the hunt had only just begun. The chase led them into a landscape scarred by a different kind of war. This was not the dense, living forest of the night before, but the skeletal remains of an industrial sector on the outskirts of a nameless town. The air, once thick with the promise of rain, now carried the acrid tang of coal dust and rust. Shattered brick buildings stood like broken teeth against the grey sky. Twisted metal skeletons of machinery reached for the heavens from the shells of factories. The ground was a treacherous mix of mud, cinders, and shattered glass. It was a place of echoes and shadows, a perfect labyrinth for their quarry. The platoon moved in a staggered line, their training taking over despite the supernatural dread that clung to them. Every collapsed wall, every gaping warehouse doorway, every pile of industrial wreckage was a potential ambush point. The boy was here. They could feel it. The air itself felt charged, watchful. Captain Sterling, his forearm hastily bandaged, moved with a feverish intensity. The boy's attack had not just wounded him physically, it had punctured his professional detachment. This was now personal. He consulted a small, high-frequency direction finder, a bulky piece of equipment one of his men carried. It was designed to track the unique energy signature of certain types of Nazi communication devices. It was now emitting a faint, intermittent ping. Subject Gamma was emitting a signal. He was leading them on. "He's herding us," Lieutenant Miller said, his voice low. He had seen this in hunting back home. You drive the game towards a cliff, or a waiting line of hunters. "I am aware of the tactic, Lieutenant," Sterling replied, not taking his eyes off the direction finder. "But we have no choice. We must engage. He cannot be allowed to reach a populated area. The intelligence he possesses, the damage he could do. And what about the Vergeltung Protocol, his final song?" Sterling didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know. The files from the bunker had been fragmentary. Vergeltung was the project's endgame, a contingency for if the subjects were compromised or the project discovered. It implied a scorched earth policy, a final, devastating act of retribution. But its nature was a complete mystery. The direction finder led them to the main gate of a massive locomotive works. The iron gates hung twisted on their hinges. The complex within was a city of its own, a sprawling maze of machine shops, warehouses, and towering gantries. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the moan of the wind through broken window panes. They passed a row of flatbed rail cars, on which sat the hulks of half-finished tank chassis, their steel already pitted with rust. This was a place where the German war machine had once breathed fire, now cold and dead. Sergeant Ross, point man for Sterling's team, signalled a halt. He pointed to the ground. In the soft earth near the entrance to the largest workshop was a single, small footprint. Fresh. The boy had gone inside. The interior of the workshop was a cathedral of industry fallen into decay. Shafts of dusty light pierced the gloom from holes in the vast roof, illuminating a forest of silent, dormant machinery. Lathes, drill presses, and forging hammers stood like prehistoric metal beasts. Chains hung from the ceiling, swaying gently. The air was thick with the smell of old grease and ozone. They moved in, clearing the space methodically, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the cavernous hall. The direction finder's ping was stronger here, a steady, rhythmic pulse. The signal was coming from the center of the workshop, from a large assembly platform. As they drew closer, they saw him. The boy was standing on the platform, his back to them. He was not trying to hide. He was waiting. Before him, on a workbench, was an array of objects that seemed bizarrely out of place. A field radio, its innards exposed and rewired with a spiderweb of new connections. Several car batteries, linked together with heavy cables. And at the center of this makeshift apparatus, a device that made Sterling's blood run cold. It was a Kriegsblitz, a German encryption machine, smaller and more portable than the famous Enigma, but just as sophisticated. It was connected to the radio and the power source. "Step away from the device, Gamma," Sterling commanded, his voice cutting through the silence. The boy did not turn. His small hands were moving over the rewired controls of the radio, making delicate adjustments. "It is almost time," he said, his voice calm, almost dreamy. "The choir is assembled. The conductor is ready." "What are you doing?" Miller asked, his Thompson raised, though the thought of firing it at the small, vulnerable looking back was abhorrent. "I am singing the song," the boy replied. "The Vergeltung protocol is not a bomb, Captain. It is a key to a locked door." He turned to face them. His eyes were no longer ancient and cold. They were alight with a fervent, religious intensity. "They put so many things inside my head. Codes, plans, names, faces. But they put other things in too. Things they did not understand. Things they found in the old places, in the dark earth. They thought they were just stories, myths. But they are real. They are sleeping. And I know how to wake them up." Sterling's mind raced, piecing together the fragments from the Ahnenerbe journal, the references to archetypical resonances and psychic archaeology. They weren't just creating spies. They were trying to weaponize the collective unconscious, to tap into primal fears, the monsters that lurked in the dark corners of the human mind. The Kindersoldat was not just a data repository. He was a psychic key, a living catalyst. "The transmission," Sterling whispered, horror dawning on him. "You're going to broadcast a signal. A psychological trigger." The boy smiled, a beatific, terrifying smile. "Not a trigger. An invitation." He threw a final switch on the radio. The Kriegsblitz machine whirred to life, its rotors spinning with a rising mechanical whine. A low-frequency hum filled the workshop, a vibration that was felt more than heard, a sensation that crawled up the spine and settled in the teeth. The lights on the radio console, powered by the car batteries, began to flash in a complex, hypnotic pattern. "Stop him!" Sterling yelled. The platoon opened fire. The roar of the M1 Garands and the chatter of the Thompson was deafening in the enclosed space. Bullets ricocheted off the heavy machinery, sparking and whining. The boy, moving with that preternatural speed, dropped behind the heavy steel of the assembly platform. But he wasn't the target. Sterling rushed forward, his own weapon forgotten, His goal, the makeshift broadcast station. He had to dismantle it, to cut the power. As he reached the workbench, a shot rang out from the platoon's perimeter. One of the soldiers, Private O'Malley, screamed and collapsed, clutching his leg. He hadn't been hit by a bullet. A heavy wrench, thrown with impossible force from the shadows of a gantry high above, had shattered his kneecap. The firing stopped. Everyone looked up. On the steel walkway, 30 feet above them, stood the boy. He held another large metal tool in his hand. "You are too late," he called down, his voice echoing. "The song is already in the air. It cannot be unheard." Sterling grabbed a cable and yanked it from the Kriegsblitz. The machine sputtered, its lights flickering, but the low hum did not cease. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, from the very metal of the building itself. A profound change began to occur in the workshop. The shadows in the corners of the vast room seemed to deepen, to congeal into something solid. The chains hanging from the ceiling began to sway more violently, though there was no draught. From deep within the forest of silent machines, a new sound emerged. A soft, slithering sound, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. Then another, and another. Private Jenkins, positioned near a row of lathes, let out a strangled gasp. He pointed a trembling finger. The shadows, they're moving. And they were. Patches of darkness detached themselves from the walls and machinery, taking on vague, shifting forms. They had no distinct features, only a suggestion of limbs and a palpable sense of malice. They moved with a silent, gliding motion, flowing towards the soldiers. A wave of pure, primal terror swept through the platoon. This was not the fear of combat, the fear of death or injury. This was the fear of the dark, the fear of the thing under the bed, the fear that every human being is born with. It was a fear made manifest. One of the shadows flowed over the wounded Private O'Malley. He did not scream. He simply went silent, his eyes rolling back in his head, his body going limp. Another soldier fired his rifle at her approaching darkness. The bullets passed through it without effect, sparking against the wall behind it. The shadow kept coming. The workshop had become a feeding ground. The Vergeltung protocol was not a physical weapon. It was a psychic broadcast, a signal that gave form and agency to the latent fears of those who heard it. The boy, Subject Gamma, had not unleashed a bomb. He had unlocked a door in the human mind and let the monsters out. Chaos erupted. The disciplined military unit disintegrated into a panicked mob. Men fired wildly into the encroaching shadows, their bullets useless. Others turned and ran, only to find their path blocked by new manifestations of their own terror. Lieutenant Miller saw one of his men, a veteran of 3 campaigns, simply curl into a fetal position, sobbing uncontrollably as a shadowy form that vaguely resembled a giant spider crouched over him. Captain Sterling stood frozen by the workbench, watching his operation, his reality, unravel. The scientific, rational world he inhabited had no framework for this. This was magic. This was madness. He looked up at the gantry. The boy was gone, a shadow, this one taking the form of a tall, gaunt man with no face. The Schattenman detached itself from a pillar and glided towards him. Sterling felt a coldness seep into his bones, a despair so profound it threatened to stop his heart. He fumbled for his pistol, his hands numb. A strong hand grabbed his arm. It was Lieutenant Miller. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror he was fighting to control, but his grip was firm. "Captain, we have to go. Now." Miller pulled Sterling away from the workbench, away from the advancing shadow. They stumbled through the nightmare scene, past men locked in silent struggles with their own personal demons. The very air was thick with dread, a suffocating miasma that made every breath a struggle. They burst out of the workshop doors and into the grey daylight of the railway yard, the screams of the platoon echoing behind them, slowly being swallowed by the relentless, hungry silence. They did not stop running until they reached the cover of a shattered goods shed 100 yards away. They collapsed behind a stack of rotting timber, gasping for air. Behind them, the locomotive works stood silent once more. The low hum had ceased. The shadows had receded. But the silence that now emanated from the building was more terrible than any sound. It was the silence of the grave. Of the 32 men who had entered the workshop, only Miller and Sterling had emerged. The others were lost, not to bullets or shells, but to the ghosts in their own heads, given form and power by a weapon they could never have imagined. The Kindersoldat had not just broken a platoon of soldiers, he had broken the very rules of war. Captain Sterling looked at his trembling hands, then at the silent, monstrous factory. The mission was a catastrophic failure. The asset was not secured, it was not terminated. It was out there, somewhere, a child soldier with the power to turn fear into a physical weapon, and he had unleashed his Virgeltongue. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. The world outside the railway works was unnervingly normal. The distant rumble of artillery, the call of a bird, the feel of the cool air on their faces, it was all a brutal contrast to the psychic hell they had just escaped. The silence from the workshop was a void, a pocket of absorbed sound and snuffed-out lives. Lieutenant Miller leaned against the timber, his body shaking with adrenaline and shock. He had seen men die in every way imaginable, but this was in violation of nature itself. Captain Sterling was a broken man. The arrogant, controlled intelligence officer was gone, replaced by a shell whose eyes darted at every movement, every shift of light and shadow. The rational foundation of his world had been demolished in there. He kept muttering to himself, fragments of equations and psychiatric profiles, as if trying to force the impossible event into a framework he could understand. The signal, a carrier wave modulating theta rhythms, combined with infrasound, mass hysteria, a shared psychotic event. He looked at Miller, his eyes pleading for validation. It has to be that, Lieutenant, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, sonic and visual manipulation. Miller just stared at him. He had seen O'Malley's kneecap shattered by a physically thrown wrench. He had seen the shadows move with purpose and intelligence. This was no hallucination. "Tell yourself whatever you need to, Captain," he said, his voice hollow. "But my men are dead. And that thing is still out there." The immediate practical problem was communication. They were 2 officers, cut off from their command, their platoon wiped out. They had to report. But what could they possibly say? Sterling insisted on using his own, secure channel. He had a small, short-range transmitter in his pack for emergency contact with his own branch. He set it up with trembling hands, sending a burst-coded message. Nightingale compromised. Vergeltung active. Asset at large. Request immediate extraction and decontamination. The word decontamination sent a fresh chill down Miller's spine. It implied something contagious. The response was swift and cryptic. A set of coordinates and a time, 4 hours from now, an extraction point 10 miles to the west, deep in territory that was still nominally contested. They had to move. The journey was a nightmare of paranoia. Every ruined building seemed to watch them pass. Every pile of rubble could conceal a small, waiting figure. They stuck to ditches and tree lines, avoiding open ground. They spoke little. The weight of what had happened, and the terrifying uncertainty of what was to come, pressed down on them. Miller's mind kept returning to the boy's words. To find a quiet place, a place where no one looks for you. He was a weapon, yes, a monster perhaps, but he was also a victim. A child who had been torn apart and reassembled into something else by monsters in lab coats. That final glimpse of loneliness in his eyes haunted Miller more than the faceless shadows in the workshop. Which was the real boy? The killer or the lost child? Or were they now inseparable? After 3 hours of tense movement, they came across a scene that halted them in their tracks. It was a small, rural hamlet, maybe 6 houses clustered around a church, or what was left of it. The place had been hit by an artillery barrage recently. Smoke still curled from blackened timbers. Walls were collapsed. And in the centre of the single street lay the bodies of the inhabitants. Men, women, a few children. They had been executed, not by shells, but by gunfire. A classic, brutal reprisal kill by retreating SS troops. But there was something wrong with the scene. The bodies were arranged, not just left where they fell, they had been dragged, placed in a rough circle. And in the center of that circle of death, a space had been cleared. In that space, sitting on an overturned bucket, was the boy. He was perfectly still, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. Miller and Sterling took cover behind the smoldering wreck of a civilian automobile. Sterling raised his pistol, his hand shaking so badly he could not aim. Miller put a hand on his arm, forcing it down. "Wait." They watched. The boy stood up. He walked over to the body of a woman, her hand outstretched as if reaching for something. He knelt beside her. He did not touch her. He simply looked, his expression unreadable from this distance. Then he did something utterly bizarre. He began to sing, a soft, lullaby-like melody in German. It was the same tune Jenkins had heard outside the bunker. As he sang, a strange tranquility seemed to settle over the horrific scene. The crows that had been circling overhead settled on the rooftops, silent. The wind died down. It was as if the violence embedded in the very soil was being soothed, neutralized. The boy was not causing this horror. He was responding to it. He was a creature born of violence, and he was drawn to it, a moth to a flame, but his relationship to it was incomprehensible. He finished his song. He stood, looked directly at their hiding place, though they were well concealed. He raised a hand, not in a threat, but in a slow, almost regretful wave. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing between two collapsed houses. They waited a full 5 minutes before moving. Miller approached the circle of bodies, a profound sense of unreality washing over him. The air here felt different, cleaner. The stench of death was still present, but the psychic residue of the atrocity, the lingering horror, was gone. It had been absorbed. "He's feeding," Sterling whispered, his voice thick with revulsion. "That's what the Ahnenerbe journals hinted at. The subjects require emotional energy. Fear, pain, despair. It's a nutrient for them. This was a banquet for him. The theory was monstrous, but it fit. The bunker, the farmhouse, the railway works, each place was a locus of intense fear and suffering. The boy was not just a passive broadcaster. He was a receiver, a consumer of human terror. The Virgeltung Protocol may have been his way of creating a feast. They left the hamlet behind, their spirits lower than ever. The extraction point was a field near a bombed-out bridge. As they approached, they saw the promised ride, a single, unmarked helicopter, its rotors spinning slowly. It was a bizarre sight, a machine from the future in this medieval landscape of destruction. 2 men in nondescript uniforms stood waiting beside it. As they drew closer, Miller realized these were not ordinary soldiers. They had the same cold, efficient aura as Sterling's original team, but amplified. Their eyes held no curiosity, only a flat operational readiness. One of them stepped forward. "Captain Sterling, I am Agent Crane. This is Agent Forbes. We are your escort." Sterling nodded, a look of grim relief on his face. "The asset. We are aware of the situation." Crane interrupted. His gaze shifted to Miller. "And you are Lieutenant Miller? You will accompany us as well." "For debriefing." The way he said debriefing left no room for argument. It sounded permanent. Miller looked at the helicopter, then back the way they had come. He thought of Jenkins, O'Malley, all his men, lost to the shadows. He thought of the boy, singing his lonely lullaby in a circle of the dead. He was not just being rescued. He was being collected. Another piece of the silent nightingale puzzle, to be filed away or erased. As they were ushered towards the helicopter's open door, Miller took one last look at the war-torn countryside. Somewhere out there, a 6-year-old weapon was wandering, a ghost in a child's skin, searching for a quiet place that probably did not exist in this world. And Miller knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that this was not over. The story of the youngest soldier of World War II was still being written, and its next chapter would be even darker. October 19th, 1944. The helicopter was a cage of noise and vibration. It did not feel like rescue. It felt like abduction. Lieutenant Miller sat strapped into the cold metal frame, the rotor's thunder drowning out all possibility of conversation. Across from him, Captain Sterling stared blankly at the floor, his bandaged forearm cradled in his lap. The two agents, Crane and Forbes, were statues, their eyes hidden behind tinted goggles, their faces devoid of any readable emotion. They looked not at the two officers they had retrieved, but through them, as if assessing damaged equipment. Miller looked out the small, grimy window. The world below was a patchwork of destruction and normalcy, a burned-out village here, a field with grazing cattle there. The war had fronts and rear areas, but the operation he was now entangled in seemed to exist in the spaces between, in the blank spots on the map. He thought of his platoon, of Jenkins hearing that ghostly song, of O'Malley's scream as his knee shattered. Their deaths would be recorded as missing in action, or killed by enemy fire. The truth was buried in that silent locomotive works, a truth so dark it had to be erased. He was now a part of that erasure. The flight lasted less than an hour. They set down in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, a place that felt utterly removed from the war. There were no unit markings, no supply dumps, no sounds of artillery. A single, long, low building made of prefabricated concrete sections squatted under the trees, its windows blacked out. It was less a military base and more a hidden tumor. A sign on the heavy double doors bore only a number. Station 73. Inside, the air was cold, filtered, and smelled of antiseptic and ozone. The lighting was a harsh, clinical white. They were led down a corridor with doors on either side, each marked with a code. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of a generator and the echo of their own footsteps. They passed an open doorway, and Miller glimpsed a laboratory filled with equipment he did not recognize, oscilloscopes, banks of whirring tape reels, and a large cylindrical tank filled with a murky, greenish fluid. They were separated. Sterling was led one way, Miller another. Agent Crane escorted Miller into a small, windowless room containing a metal table and two chairs. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound final. Crane did not sit. He stood by the door, a silent sentinel. After a wait that felt like an hour, the door opened and a woman entered. She was perhaps in her 40s, with severe, sharp features and hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a white lab coat over a military uniform, but her rank was obscured. She carried a file folder thick with papers. She sat down opposite Miller, placing the folder on the table. Her eyes, a pale, calculating blue, studied him with an intensity that was both professional and deeply invasive. "Lieutenant Miller, I am Dr. Richter." Her accent was faint, Germanic, but her English was flawless. "You have had a unique experience. I need you to tell me everything. From the moment you found the bunker. Do not omit a single detail, no matter how trivial or how impossible it may seem." And so, he talked. For what felt like hours, he poured out the entire, unbelievable story. The collapsed bunker, the eerie sounds, Captain Sterling's arrival, the boy in the clearing, the message in the farmhouse, the slaughter at the railway works, the shadows that moved, the song in the hamlet. He held nothing back. He described the feeling of the air growing thick with dread, the way fear became a physical force. He told her about the look in the boy's eyes, ancient one moment, utterly lost the next. Dr. Richter listened without interruption, her expression never changing. She took no notes. She simply watched him, her gaze fixed on his face as if reading a text written on his skin. When he finally fell silent, exhausted and hollowed out, she leaned back slightly. "You are a reliable observer, Lieutenant," she said, her tone neutral. "Your service record is exemplary. Your account, while extraordinary, is consistent with the known parameters of the Kindersoldat initiative." "Known parameters?" Miller asked, his voice hoarse. "You knew about this? You knew they were creating things like that?" "We knew of the attempt." She corrected him. "The Nazi obsession with the occult and the pseudoscientific is well documented. The Ahnenerbe was a carnival of madmen, but occasionally, a carnival has a genuine freak. The Kindersoldat program was their most ambitious and most terrifying project." It was not merely about creating spies. It was about forging a new type of human being, one who could interface with the fundamental archetypes of the human psyche. She opened the folder. Inside were photographs, schematics, and pages of dense script. She slid a photograph toward him. It was a younger doctor, Richter, standing with a group of men in civilian clothes. In the background was a building he recognized from his university days, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Before the war, my field was the emerging study of parapsychology and collective consciousness. We were theoretical. The Nazis, however, were not theorists. They were practitioners. They took our nascent ideas and applied them with a brutality we could never have conceived. They did not try to understand the unconscious mind. They sought to weaponize it. She tapped another photograph. It was a diagram of a human brain, covered in intricate electrical connections. The process they called cognitive integration was a form of radical psychic surgery. They used a combination of hallucinogenic drugs, sensory deprivation, and precisely calibrated electromagnetic fields to soften the boundaries of the self, to make the subject's mind a receptive vessel. Then, they attempted to implant not just data, but psychic impressions, raw emotional states, primal fears, the building blocks of myth. Miller felt a cold understanding dawn. The shadows, the things we saw. Egregores, Dr. Richter said calmly. A term from esoteric tradition, a thought, form, given energy and a semblance of life by belief and emotional focus. The Kindersoldat subjects were not just carrying secrets, they were walking focal points for these constructs. The Vergeltung protocol was designed to amplify this ability exponentially, to allow the subject to project these forms into the minds of others, making them temporarily real. You did not just see your fear, Lieutenant. You collectively gave it a body, and the subject fed it to you. The clinical explanation was somehow more whore than the experience itself. It meant it was real. Not a ghost, not a demon, but a perversion of science. A technology of the soul. The boy. Subject Gamma. He said he was looking for a quiet place. Dr. Richter's composure faltered for a microsecond. A flicker of something pity in her eyes. The primary flaw in the program was the source material. They used children because of their neurological plasticity. But a child's mind, no matter how brutally conditioned, retains a core identity, a desire for safety, for comfort. The conflict between this innate drive and the horrific programming they imposed creates instability. Subject Gamma is the only prototype to have survived the process. He is uniquely powerful, and he is broken. He is a scared little boy who has been turned into a god of nightmares. He does not know what he is, only what he has been made to do. What happens now? Miller asked. You have to stop him. Stop him? Dr. Richter almost smiled. Lieutenant, we are not here to stop him. We are here to understand him. The Soviet NKVD has a similar program based on stolen German research. The future of global power may not lie with the atomic bomb, but with the mastery of the human mind. Subject Gamma is not a threat to be eliminated. He is an intelligence asset of incalculable value. Our orders are to reacquire him. Miller stared at her, disgust rising in his throat. They saw the boy as a tool, a weapon to be captured and turned against their new enemies. The cycle was just continuing. He killed my entire platoon. Regrettable casualties in a new kind of war, she said, her voice devoid of regret. A war that will be fought not in trenches but in the dreams of populations. Captain Sterling failed in his mission because he saw Gamma as a military objective. You, Lieutenant, you have seen him as something more. You have seen the child. That perspective may be the key. She stood up, gathering her folder. You will be reassigned. Effective immediately, you are detached from your infantry division and assigned to the Silent Nightingale Task Force. Your knowledge makes you a liability in the conventional forces. Your experience makes you an asset to us. You will help us find him. The door opened. Agent Crane was still waiting. Miller felt a profound numbness settle over him. He had not been rescued. He had been conscripted into a deeper, darker conflict. He was now a soldier in the war after the war, a war that would have no monuments, no glory, and no end. He was taken to a small, cell-like room with a cot, a desk, and a single bare light bulb. His personal effects were gone. His uniform was replaced with a set of plain, olive-drab fatigues with no insignia. He was a ghost now. He sat on the edge of the cot, his head in his hands. The image of the boy waving from the circle of corpses burned behind his eyes. He was hunting a child who was also a weapon, a victim who was also a monster. Later that night, a soft knock came at his door. It was Captain Sterling. He looked even worse than before, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken. He slipped inside, closing the door quietly. "They're lying to us, Miller," he whispered, his voice frantic. "This whole facility. It's not about containing the threat. It's about replicating it." "What are you talking about?" "I saw the reports, in the lab. They're not just studying gamma. They're trying to reverse engineer the process. They have test subjects. Children, orphaned, displaced persons they're bringing in from the camps." The revelation hit Miller like a physical blow. The Allies were supposed to be the liberators, the good guys. But here, in this concrete bunker in the German forest, they were preparing to commit the same atrocities they had gone to war to stop. The enemy wasn't just across the lines. The enemy was an idea, a temptation, the thirst for ultimate power. And it had infected his own side. "We have to get out of here," Sterling said, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "We have to find Gamma before they do. Not to capture him, to kill him. It's the only way to stop this. To burn the knowledge out of the world." Miller looked at the broken, desperate man in front of him. Sterling, the cold intelligence officer, had now seen the abyss and wanted to seal it shut. But Miller had seen the child in the monster. He thought of the boy's quest for a quiet place. He didn't know what the right thing was anymore. To kill the boy was to murder a victim. To let him live was to unleash a weapon. To let Silent Nightingale capture him was to perpetuate the evil. The two men, bound together by a shared nightmare, stood in the dim room, trapped between impossible choices. The hunt for the youngest soldier of World War II was no longer a mission. It had become a race between those who wanted to use him, those who wanted to destroy him, and one lieutenant who no longer knew what he was supposed to do, but knew he could not stay in this sterile hell. The door to his room was locked from the outside, but Sterling, in his former position, had ways. He produced a small, thin pick from a seam in his uniform. "They think I'm broken," he muttered, working at the lock. "They've gotten careless." With a soft click, the door was unlocked. Sterling cracked it open, peering into the empty corridor. "The generator is on the lower level. If we can sabotage it, it will create a distraction. There's a motor pool half a mile east through the woods. We can be gone before they realize what's happened." Miller nodded, his heart thudding. This was treason, desertion. But it felt like the first sane act he had committed since seeing that collapsed bunker wall. He followed Sterling into the corridor. The hum of the facility seemed louder now, more menacing. They were not just escaping a base. They were escaping a future they wanted no part of. They moved like shadows, Sterling leading the way with a certainty that suggested he had memorized the layout. They reached a stairwell and descended one level. The air grew warmer, filled with the smell of diesel fuel and hot metal. The generator room was ahead, a large, vault-like door slightly ajar. Sterling gestured for Miller to keep watch. He slipped inside. Miller stood in the dim stairwell, his senses screaming. Every sound was amplified. The drip of water, the distant echo of a voice, the frantic beating of his own heart. He thought of Dr. Richter's cold, assessing eyes. He thought of the children Sterling claimed were here. The moral landscape of his world had been inverted. A sudden loud clang came from the generator room, followed by a curse from Sterling. Then, the lights flickered, dimmed, and went out. A deep, grinding roar echoed from the generator room, followed by an abrupt, deafening silence. The emergency lights snapped on, casting a dim red glow. Alarms began to blare. Shouted orders echoed through the corridors. Their distraction was created. Sterling emerged from the room, his face smudged with grease. "It's done. Let's go." They scrambled back up the stairwell. The corridor on the main level was chaos. Figures ran back and forth in the crimson emergency light, their shapes distorted and monstrous. They used the confusion, slipping past distracted technicians and security personnel. A side door, an emergency exit, was their goal. They burst out into the cold night air. The forest was a wall of blackness before them. They ran, their boots crunching on fallen pine needles, not caring about the noise, only about putting distance between themselves and Station 73. After 10 minutes of frantic sprinting, they stopped, leaning against trees, gasping for breath. The alarms were a distant wail now. They were out. "What now?" Miller asked, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Now," Sterling said, pulling a folded map from inside his jacket. "We find him. We have a head start. Richter and her people will be scrambling, trying to cover up the breach and restart their power. They'll assume we're trying to get back to Allied lines. They won't expect us to go deeper into the hunt." He unfolded the map. It was marked with several locations, all circled in red. These are places of intense recent psychological trauma. Mass graves, sites of reprisal killings, concentration camps. According to Richter's theory, Gamma will be drawn to these places. He needs the energy. He's a shark, and he has to keep moving, keep feeding. Miller looked at the map. The circled locations formed a rough, terrible constellation of suffering across the German countryside. They were going to follow a trail of corpses, to find a boy who fed on pain. "And when we find him?" Miller asked, though he dreaded the answer. Sterling's face was hard in the moonlight. "We do what should have been done in that bunker. We put him down, for his sake and for ours." They began to move, two ghosts in a forest of the dead, hunting the one ghost who mattered. The war for the youngest soldier's soul had begun, and it would be fought in the darkest places the world had to offer. November 3rd, 1944. The forest was a cathedral of silence, the kind of silence that comes after a great sound has passed through, leaving everything stunned and hollow. Miller and Sterling moved through it like penitents, their every footfall a sacrilege against the quiet. They had been walking for days, following Sterling's grim map of sorrow. They avoided roads, villages, even the paths of their own advancing army. They were phantoms now, operating in the blind spot between two colossal forces, their only compass the pull of human suffering. The rations they'd taken from Station 73 were running low. The trust between them was thinner still. Sterling's resolve had hardened into a single, sharp point: find and terminate. His sleep was fitful, plagued by whispers only he could hear. Sometimes he would wake, his pistol drawn, aiming at shadows that flickered just beyond the firelight. Miller watched him deteriorate. The captain was a tight coil, winding itself towards a violent snap. Miller, on the other hand, felt himself unraveling. The image of the boy Gamma was seared into his mind, not as a monster, but as that lonely figure in the circle of the dead, singing his terrible lullaby. He replayed Dr. Richter's words, a scared little boy who has been turned into a god of nightmares. Which was the greater sin? To destroy the creation, or to become the new creator, as Silent Nightingale intended? He had no answers, only the memory of his men's screams. Their path led them to a place the map did not name. The air began to change. It grew thick, carrying a smell that was both sweet and foul, a cloying mixture of rot and wood smoke. It was a smell that stuck to the back of the throat, a taste of death on the wind. They crested a low hill and looked down into a shallow valley. What they saw was not a battlefield. It was a factory. A complex of low, wooden barracks surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire. Watchtowers stood at intervals, their searchlights dark and skeletal against the grey sky. The main gate stood open, swinging gently in the wind. The place was abandoned, but it was not empty. The silence here was different from the forest. It was a heavy, loaded silence, pregnant with a horror that had happened slowly, systematically, not in the explosive instant of a shell. A work camp, Sterling whispered, his voice rough. He consulted his map, his finger tracing a line to a location that was marked not with a circle, but with a black, inked-in square, a place so dark it absorbed the light. This is one of theirs, one of the places Richter theorized he would be drawn to, a reservoir of pain. As they drew closer, the details resolved into sharper, more terrible focus. Piles of discarded shoes, mountains of them, spilling from a storage shed, a row of crude brick chimneys. The ground near one of the fences was churned to mud, and scattered across it were thousands of tiny, pale fragments. It took Miller a moment to realize they were human bones, crushed and scattered by the treads of vehicles. He stopped, his stomach heaving. He had heard rumors of these places, whispers among the troops, but hearing was nothing. Seeing was an assault on the soul. This was not the heroic death of combat. This was something vile, a calculated industry of extinction. Sterling seemed unaffected, his clinical detachment a shield against the horror. He was scanning the camp, his eyes narrowed. "Look," he said, pointing. In the center of the compound, between two long barracks, a small, faint figure was moving. It was him. Gamma. He was walking slowly, his head down, as if following a path only he could see. He would pause sometimes, kneeling to touch the mud, or looking up at the empty watchtowers with a strange, detached curiosity. "He's here," Sterling breathed, a hunter's gleam in his eye. He checked his pistol, the motion crisp and final. "This ends now." "Sterling, wait," Miller said, grabbing his arm. "Look at him. He's not feeding. He's just walking. He's a shark, Miller. Circling. This place is an ocean for him. We have to move before he senses us and vanishes again." They entered the camp through the main gate. The sheer scale of the silence was overwhelming. It was a silence that had absorbed too much sound, too many cries, too many whimpers, too many final, unanswered questions. Their footsteps on the gravel path sounded like gunshots. Gamma did not flee. He seemed unaware of their approach, or unconcerned by it. He had reached a large, open area near the chimneys, a place where the prisoners must have been forced to assemble for roll call. He stood in the very center, his back to them, perfectly still. Sterling raised his pistol, taking a two-handed stance. The range was less than 50 yards. An easy shot. "Subject Gamma," he shouted, his voice echoing flatly in the dead air. "Turn around." The boy did not turn. He slowly raised his arms, palms facing the sky, as if feeling for a rain that would not fall. "Last warning." Sterling's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't!" Miller pleaded, but it was too late. Sterling fired. The shot was loud, a brutal violation of the sacred silence. The bullet kicked up a puff of dirt a few feet to the boy's left. He had missed. Sterling never missed. Gamma slowly turned. His face was peaceful, but his eyes were deep, black pools. They were not the eyes of a child or an ancient or a monster. They were the eyes of the camp itself. They held the condensed suffering of thousands. "You are loud," Gamma said, his voice not his own. It was a chorus of whispers, the echo of a multitude speaking through a single, small throat. "You bring your little fears here, your little angers. They are noise." Sterling fired again, and again. Each shot went wide, whining off the brick of a chimney, or burying itself in the wooden wall of a barrack. It was as if an invisible force was deflecting the bullets, a wall of concentrated sorrow protecting the boy. Gamma took a step towards them, then another. He did not walk so much as glide, his feet not seeming to touch the mud. "This is a quiet place," the chorus voice whispered. "It is full of a great silence. The silence after the crying stops. I have been listening. I have learned their song." The air began to thicken, just as it had in the railway works. But this was different. This was not the manifestation of personal, individual fears. This was something vast, collective, and historical. The very atmosphere grew heavy, pressing down on them. Miller felt a weight of despair, so immense it threatened to crush him into the earth. He saw visions not of spiders or shadow men, but of skeletal figures in striped uniforms, of hollow eyes staring from behind wire, of piles of emaciated bodies being pushed by bulldozers. The collective memory of the camp was rising around them, not as ghosts, but as a pervasive, soul-destroying atmosphere. Sterling was on his knees, his pistol forgotten in the mud. He was clutching his head, rocking back and forth. "Make it stop!" he moaned. "Make it stop." The clinical part of his mind, the part that demanded rational explanations, was being systematically dismantled by a horror that was utterly, incontrovertibly real. Gamma stood over him, looking down with those awful, absorbing eyes. "You wanted to see what I am, Captain." "Look," Sterling screamed. It was a short, sharp sound that was cut off abruptly. He fell onto his side, curling into a fetal position, his eyes wide and unseeing, just like Private Cooper's. He had been hollowed out, his mind scoured by a pain too great for any one man to bear. Miller stood frozen, the visions washing over him. He saw his own men among the dead, their faces gaunt, their uniforms in tatters. He felt the guilt of survival, the crushing responsibility of being a witness. He wanted to lie down and die, to let the silence take him too. But then he looked at Gamma. The boy was not triumphant. He was weary. The chorus of whispers had faded, and his own small voice returned, thin and frayed. "It is never quiet," the boy said, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "Even here, the silence is too loud." In that moment, Miller understood. Gamma wasn't feeding on the pain. He was connected to it. He was a conduit, a living monument to every atrocity committed within these fences. He didn't cause the horror. He resonated with it. He was trapped in a feedback loop of suffering, constantly absorbing it, forever seeking a peace that the energy of these places would never provide. The quiet place he sought was an impossibility. He was a creature of noise, and he would never escape it. The boy looked at Miller, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the camp fell away, and Miller saw only a terrified, exhausted child. "Help me," Gamma whispered. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing between the barracks, leaving Miller alone in the field of ghosts with the catatonic shell of Captain Sterling. The oppressive weight lifted. The visions faded. The camp returned to its own true silence. Miller knelt beside Sterling. The captain was breathing, but he was gone. His mind had broken under the weight of a truth he could not process. Miller was alone. The mission was in ruins. The hunter was captured. The other was lost. He had a choice. He could try to carry Sterling out, find help, re-enter the world he had deserted. Or he could follow the boy. Not to kill him. Not to capture him, but to answer his plea. To help him find a silence that did not hurt. He looked at the broken man on the ground. Then he looked in the direction the boy had gone. The moral calculus of his world had been burned away in the fires of this place. There was no right side anymore. There was only a lost child, and a soldier who had failed to save so many others. He stood up. He left Captain Sterling there, in the center of that terrible quiet. He shouldered his pack, and he began to walk, following the faint, fading imprint of small footsteps in the mud. He was no longer a soldier of any army. He was just a man, walking into the heart of a darkness that had swallowed a world, hoping to find one small, flickering light within it. November 9th, 1944. The forest on the other side of the camp was a different world. The trees were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches weaving a canopy that blotted out the weak afternoon Sunday. It was a primeval place, untouched by the war's machinery, yet it felt just as haunted. Miller moved with a new purpose, one that was fragile and born of despair. He was not tracking a weapon. He was following a child. The weight of his rifle, once a comfort, was now an alien burden. He considered discarding it, but some deep-seated instinct for self-preservation kept it slung over his shoulder. Gamma's trail was not difficult to follow. It was not just footprints. It was a path of subtle disturbances. A patch of moss would be withered and blackened, as if touched by a sudden frost. The air would grow cold and still in his wake, the birdsong ceasing for 100-yard radius. He was leaking his power, a psychic residue that poisoned the very air. Miller realized the boy was not in control. The vast ocean of pain he had absorbed at the camp was overflowing, spilling out of him. He was a cup filled to breaking, and he was cracking. For 2 days, Miller followed this trail of silent decay. He ate the last of his rations, a hardtack biscuit that tasted of dust. His water was gone, and he drank from cold, clear streams, hoping the boy's influence had not tainted them. He slept fitfully, propped against trees, his dreams filled with the hollow eyes from the camp and Sterling's final broken scream. On the 3rd morning, the trail led him to a river, wide and fast-flowing, grey with glacial runoff, and there, on a gravel bar on the far side, he saw him. Gamma was sitting on a large, flat rock, hugging his knees to his chest. He was rocking back and forth, a slow, rhythmic motion of distress. He was too far away to hear, but Miller could see his shoulders shaking. He was crying. This was not the terrifying conduit of collective suffering. This was a small, lonely boy, lost and afraid. Miller's soldierly caution warred with a surge of pity that felt like a physical pain. He had to cross the river. He found a narrow, fallen tree that spanned the torrent and inched his way across, his arms outstretched for balance. The water roared below him, hungry and cold. When he reached the other side, he approached slowly, making no sudden movements. Gamma did not look up. His sobs were quiet, hitching breaths that seemed to be torn from him. Up close, Miller could see how thin he was, how the oversized German tunic hung from his frame like a shroud. His hair was matted with leaves and dirt. "I can't make it stop," the boy whispered, his voice raw and small. "The pictures, the sounds, they won't go away. They're always there." Miller knelt a dozen feet away, keeping his distance. "I know," he said, his own voice rough from disuse. "I saw." Gamma lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, but the terrifying black pools were gone. For now, he was just a child. "You are the one who did not shoot, the one who saw the song. My name is Miller." The boy considered this. "I had a name. Once, I think it was Carl." He said it with no recognition, as if referring to a character in a story he'd been told long ago. "Carl," Miller repeated softly. "That's a good name. They took it away," Carl said, his gaze drifting back to the rushing water. "They poured the cold light into my head and the name fell out. Now I am just Gamma, a letter, a thing." The sheer, stark horror of that statement settled between them. Miller felt his hatred shift, its target moving from the boy to the faceless men in lab coats who had done this. They were the real monsters. "I want to help you, Carl," Miller said. It was the truth. He didn't know how, but the objective was clear. It was the only objective that made any sense left in the world. The boy looked at him, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. "Can you make it quiet?" "Inside, I don't know," Miller admitted, "but I can try. We can try to find a place where they can't find you, a place away from all of this." He gestured vaguely at the world around them, at the war, at the memory of the camp. For a long moment, the boy just stared at him, his ancient eyes searching Miller's face for deception. Then, he gave a slow, hesitant nod. It was a fragile, impossible alliance. The hunter and the hunted, now walking together. Miller led the way, choosing a direction away from the front lines, away from the concentrations of people and pain, deep into the wilderness of the Harz Mountains. Carl followed a few paces behind, a silent, ghostly shadow. They did not speak much. The boy was often lost in his own inner hell, his face contorting in silent anguish as some unseen memory assailed him. Sometimes, he would hum that same, haunting lullaby, a sound that now seemed less eerie and more profoundly sad. Miller shared his water, what little he could find. He tried to set snares for rabbits, but he had no skill. They were both growing weaker. Carl's power, his curse, seemed to be turning inward. The patches of frost-blighted vegetation no longer appeared around him. Instead, he would sometimes stumble, his small body racked with a sudden, violent shiver, as if fighting a fever. On the 5th day of their journey, they took shelter in a shallow cave as a cold rain began to fall. Miller managed to get a small fire going with damp wood, the smoke stinging their eyes. Carl sat huddled near the flames, his teeth chattering. "It's getting harder," the boy confessed, staring into the fire. "To keep them out, the loud ones." "The loud ones?" Miller asked, warming his hands. "The ones who want to use me." "The woman. The cold woman. She is looking. She sings a different song. A sharp song. It hurts my ears. Dr. Richter." Miller's blood ran cold. Silent Nightingale was still active. They were still searching. And according to Carl, they were close. "Can you feel them?" Miller asked, his voice tense. Carl nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "They are in the sky. A metal bird with no sound. It listens for the noise in my head. An aircraft. A modified reconnaissance plane, equipped with whatever esoteric sensors Dr. Richter's science had devised. They were being hunted from the air. Their head start was evaporating. "We have to keep moving," Miller said, the soldier in him reawakening. "We need to find cover. Thicker forest." But Carl was shaking his head, a look of profound exhaustion on his face. "I am tired. So tired of running." He looked at Miller, his expression pleading. "You said you would help. I am helping." "No," the boy said, his voice gaining a strange, resigned strength. "There is only one way to help me. You have to do what the other one wanted to do." Miller stared at him, comprehension dawning with a sickening lurch. "No, Carl, no. It is the only quiet place," the boy whispered, tears welling in his eyes again. "The forever quiet. I have seen it in the minds of the ones who went there. It is peace. Please." The request, made with the simple, devastating logic of a child, shattered Miller's remaining composure. This was the end of the road. Not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet plea in a rainy cave. The boy saw death not as a punishment, but as a sanctuary, the ultimate quiet place. "I can't," Miller choked out, his own eyes stinging. "I can't do that. Then they will find me," Carl said, his small shoulders slumping in defeat. "And the cold woman will put me back in the dark. And she will make more of me. More letters, more things. The noise will never end." The truth of it was unbearable. Miller looked at the boy, truly looked at him. He saw the victim of unspeakable cruelty, a soul that had been twisted into a weapon and then broken by its own function. He saw the key to a future of unimaginable horror if Silent Nightingale succeeded. And he saw a child, begging for release. The moral certainty he had been searching for since the bunker collapsed finally crystallized, and it was horrifying. The most merciful act, the most human act, was also the most monstrous. The sound came then, faint but distinct over the patter of the rain. The dull, throbbing pulse of an aircraft engine. It was far away, but it was searching, getting closer. Carl looked up at the cave roof, as if he could see through the rock. "They are here." Miller met the boy's gaze. In those ancient, tired eyes he saw a final, desperate hope. Hope for silence, hope for an end. The engine sound grew louder. November 12th, 1944. The sound of the aircraft was a drill boring into the fragile silence of the cave. It was not the familiar roar of a fighter plane or the lumbering drone of a bomber. This was a lower, slower, more deliberate sound, a predatory hum. It circled overhead, the pitch of its engine changing as it banked and turned. A hawk riding a thermal, its unseen eyes scanning the ground below. Carl curled into a tighter ball, his hands pressed over his ears, his whole body trembling. "They are listening," he whimpered, his voice muffled. "The sharp song is very loud now." Miller's mind raced, options flashing and dying like sputtering light bulbs. They could run, but where? The aircraft would see them in the open. They could hide, but Carl's very presence seemed to be a beacon they could track. The cave was a trap, the fire was a signal. They were pinned. He looked at the boy, this small, shivering vessel of unimaginable pain. Carl's plea echoed in his head, a terrible logical solution to an impossible problem. The forever quiet. It was the only mercy left to give. The alternative was a fate worse than death, a return to the darkness of a laboratory, to be studied, replicated, his torment multiplied and weaponized for a new, colder war. The aircraft made another pass, lower this time. The vibrations from its engine shook loose a fine dust from the cave ceiling. "They are landing," Carl whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "Close." Miller made his decision. It was not a soldier's decision. It was not a hero's decision. It was the decision of a man who had run out of roads, who saw only a cliff edge and a single, terrible way to prevent a greater fall. He felt a part of his own soul wither and die in that moment. He unslung his rifle. The action was slow, dreamlike. The cold weight of the wood and steel in his hands felt alien, blasphemous. Carl watched him, his trembling subsiding. A strange calm settled over his features. The fear was replaced by a profound, heartbreaking acceptance. He uncurled himself and sat up straight, facing Miller. He did not look at the rifle. He looked at Miller's eyes. "Will it be quick?" the boy asked, his voice small but clear. Miller could not speak. His throat was sealed shut with a grief so vast it had no sound. He merely nodded, a single, jerky motion. "Thank you," Carl said. Those 2 words were the most devastating weapons Miller had ever encountered. They shattered what was left of him. He raised the rifle. The stock felt like a block of ice against his cheek. His vision blurred with tears. The small, pale face in the gun sights wavered. He saw not a monster, not a weapon, not a German soldier. He saw a little boy named Carl, who had lost his name and just wanted the noise to stop. The hum of the aircraft was directly overhead now. He could hear shouts from outside, distant but closing. Dr. Richter's team, the hunters. He took a final, shuddering breath. His finger found the trigger. The world narrowed to the curve of the boy's cheek, a smudge of dirt, a single tear tracing a path through it. "Find a quiet place," Miller whispered. The words a ragged prayer. He fired. The report was deafening in the confined space, a single, sharp crack that swallowed the world. It echoed off the stone walls, then was gone, replaced by a ringing silence that was more absolute than any he had ever known. The small figure slumped backward, a marionette with its strings cut. There was no dramatic spray of blood, no cry, just a sudden, utter stillness. Miller dropped the rifle. It clattered on the stone floor, the sound obscenely loud. He stumbled forward, his legs unable to support him. He fell to his knees beside the boy. He reached out a trembling hand, brushing the hair from Carl's forehead. The skin was still warm, the eyes were closed. He looked, for the first time since Miller had laid eyes on him, truly at peace. The ancient pain was gone, the terrifying power was gone. All that remained was a child, finally silent. The shouts from outside were closer now. Urgent. He could hear the crunch of boots on gravel, the static hiss of a radio. They were at the cave entrance. Miller looked down at his hands. They were clean. There was no blood. But he felt stained, forever marked by this act of terrible mercy. He had set out to be a soldier, to fight monsters. He had ended by killing a child to save him from becoming one. There was no victory here. There was only a loss so complete it felt like the end of everything. A beam of bright electric light pierced the gloom of the cave, pinning him in its glare. "Freeze! Do not move!" a voice commanded. Miller did not look up. He kept his eyes on Carl's peaceful face. He heard the cautious footsteps of multiple people entering the cave. Dr. Richter's voice, cold and sharp as surgical steel, cut through the silence. "What have you done?" Miller finally lifted his head. Dr. Richter stood there, flanked by Agents Crane and Forbes. They were dressed in heavy weather gear, their faces grim. Behind them, other figures crowded the entrance. "I gave him what he wanted," Miller said, his voice a hollow rasp. Quiet. Richter's composure shattered. A raw, furious disbelief contorted her features. She rushed forward, pushing past Miller and dropping to her knees beside Carl's body. She pressed her fingers to his neck, feeling for a pulse that was not there. She leaned close, listening for a breath that would never come. "You fool," she hissed, whirling on Miller. "You unimaginable fool. Do you have any idea what you have destroyed? The knowledge, the potential. It was beyond price. He was a child," Miller said, the words flat and dead. "He was the key," Richter screamed, her voice echoing in the cave. The key to understanding the human psyche, to mastering fear itself. We could have ended conflict. We could have built a new world. You would have built a bigger cage, Miller replied. He felt nothing now. No anger, no fear, just a vast, empty exhaustion. You would have become them. Agent Crane stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He looked from the dead boy to Miller. Lieutenant Miller, you are under arrest for the destruction of a vital Allied intelligence asset and for desertion. Miller didn't resist. He offered his hands. Crane snapped a pair of cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. As they led him from the cave, Miller took one last look over his shoulder. Dr. Richter was still crouched by the body, not in grief, but in the posture of a scientist who has just seen her life's work go up in flames. She was already pulling instruments from her pack, preparing to dissect the mystery, even in death. They pushed him out into the cold, rainy afternoon. The aircraft, a strange, unmarked transport plane with overly long wings, sat in a clearing a few hundred yards away. The propellers were still turning slowly, whipping the mist into a frenzy. As they marched him towards it, Miller looked up at the grey, indifferent sky. He thought of the bunker, of Jenkins, of Sterling, of the shadows in the workshop, of the silent camp. He thought of a lullaby sung in a circle of the dead. He had set out to uncover the story of the youngest soldier of World War II. He had found it, and it had, as promised, broken his heart. Not with a shatter, but with a slow, cold crack that would never, ever heal. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was just a man who had carried a terrible weight to a quiet place, and was now left with the silence.